This is the first presentation, the first recording on 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. It deals with general observations, especially related to structure. First, atmosphere. Now, can you think of a moment or a situation where you feared or dreaded something, and that something that was burdening you then was cancelled, removed, changed? It did not happen, and it became clear that it wasn't going to happen. Now, try to recall that sense of relief that came with the change. That is how Paul must have been feeling as he was writing 1st Thessalonians. He had been burdened by serious concern about the newly planted church in Thessalonica, and Timothy had just come back with good news. The church was persevering, the church was making it. It was actually doing quite well. So there's an enormous sense of relief that marks the atmosphere of this letter. It's a very positive atmosphere. And one way it expresses itself is in the amount of thanksgiving that Paul expresses. Now, normally, Paul has one passage of thanksgiving at the beginning of a letter. Here, however, in 1st Thessalonians he has 3, and in 2nd Thessalonians, a rather short letter, he still has 2. So that's a substantial amount of thanksgiving that's expressed in the 2 letters. With the thanksgiving, there's also quite a bit of prayer and benediction that goes on. It's especially interesting to note the benedictions at the end of the last thanksgivings in each letters, and we'll do that now. Here's the first one from 1st Thessalonians chapter 3. By the way, the F here means 3 verse 12F, means that it's verse 12 and the following verse, verse 13, that's being quoted. So you'll see that come back a number of times. Notice also that I have highlighted certain key terms in these benedictions. Terms that we'll have a look at again at a later point in another presentation, because they will help us to see the core, the heart of Paul's message in the 2 Thessalonian epistles. So, may the Lord make you increase and abound in love for one another and for all, as we do for you, so that He may establish your hearts blameless in holiness before our God and Father. Now, there's an interesting closing benediction in chapter 5, a well-known verse that parallels this benediction. Let's have a look at that one as well before we move on to 2nd Thessalonians. Oh, may the God of peace Himself sanctify you completely. May your whole spirit and soul and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. And then the key benediction at the end of the second and last thanksgiving in 2nd Thessalonians. Now may our Lord Jesus Christ Himself and God our Father, who loved us and gave us eternal comfort and good hope through grace, comfort your hearts and establish them in every good work and word. Here too there's an additional benediction, not quite at the end, that parallels this one in some ways. May the Lord direct your hearts to the love of God and to the steadfastness of Christ. So that's the atmosphere and the thanksgiving prayer that goes on here. It includes some of the key terms to which we'll return at a later point. Now let's look at this theme of the second coming. The term itself doesn't appear in the letter, second coming, but clearly Paul refers to it a number of times. Mostly he simply uses the term coming, the coming of our Lord, the coming of Jesus Christ. This lists the passages in First Thessalonians. Of course, there's also several in Second Thessalonians. I wonder if you look at this list, if you notice something. One thing to notice, of course, is that obviously this is a major topic in the letter, but there's something else. Apart from chapter 5, verse 1 through 11, each of these references appears at the very end of a chapter. In other words, Paul ends each chapter with a reference to the second coming, and he has used this to structure his letter. So it is indeed possible to divide and structure the letter by chapters based on these references. It's not the only way, but it's certainly a possible way to structure this letter. This is another observation on the structure of First Thessalonians. It has two parts, as do quite a few of Paul's letters, but not as in other letters, a theological or doctrinal part and then a practical part on the Christian life. Here, the first part is highly relational and very personal. And the second part deals with specific issues, both theological and practical. So this too is part of the structure of First Thessalonians. We'll have a look at one more area of general observation, and that is the summary statements that appear in this letter. Not summary statements of the letter content, but more general summary statements that Paul includes here. And here are two that stand out because they include something we actually know reasonably well from Paul. This threesome: faith, love, hope. It's especially known because Paul uses it in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the great poem on love. But here in 1 Thessalonians he actually uses it two times to summarize the Christian way of life. These three terms, well, say it all in a sense. Faith, love, hope. That's what it's about. Interestingly, Paul here uses sort of a forerunner of the spiritual armor analogy that he's going to use much more extensively in Ephesians chapter 6 by speaking of the breastplate of faith and love, and then the helmet of the hope of salvation in chapter 5. With this, Paul gives the new believers in Thessalonica a simple formula to remember what the Christian life is all about. Let's look at a few more and then try to see what they're really about. You turn to God from idols to serve the living and true God. You wait for His Son from heaven, whom He raised from the dead, Jesus, who delivers us from the wrath to come. Walk in a manner worthy of God, who calls you into His own kingdom and glory. God has not destined us for wrath, but to attain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us so that whether we are awake or asleep, we might live with Him. God chose you as the first fruits to be saved through sanctification by the Spirit and belief in the truth, as another way of summarizing the Christian life. To this He called you through our gospel, so that you may obtain the glory of our Lord Jesus Christ. God our Father, who loved us and gave us eternal comfort and good hope through grace. Now, such general summary statements are typical of Paul, but there's especially many in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And that makes sense because he's writing to new believers, and he's reminding them of, well, of what? Really of the gospel, and what it means to live in the gospel, and what the aim and end result of the gospel is. And so these statements summarize that, the gospel, and remind the readers of what they have begun to believe in. The interesting thing to notice is how many of these statements focus on either God or Jesus and then add something about them. Look at the following example. It's about God and Jesus Christ, and often Paul will then add something beginning with who. Jesus Christ, who died for us, so that whether we are awake or asleep, we might live with him. So in most of these summary statements, it's actually God or Jesus who's the one taking the initiative, who's the one acting. It's what God or Jesus did or does or will do for us, for believers. And it's therefore very personal. It's not first and foremost about doctrine or religious practice or a religious system. It's about a person. It's God himself, it's Jesus Christ, who is at the center of all of this, and of course at the center of the gospel and Christian faith. This is the end of this presentation. So much for general observation. We now need to spend some time on the historical background.